So very good morning, and let me begin with the very important occasion today of Sri Aurobindo's 148th birth anniversary. 15th of August is tomorrow. It's a very important day in the history of India, in the history of our nation, in the history of the world. Sri Aurobindo's 5 dreams, which he wrote and penned down on the 15th of August, 1947, um, uh, clearly delineates his vision for a new world, for a new country, and for a new humanity. This morning, I'd like to speak about Sri Aurobindo's life-transforming yoga. The mother wrote about Sri Aurobindo. What Sri Aurobindo represents in the world's history is not a teaching, not even a revelation. It is a decisive action, straight and direct from the Supreme. I think these words from the mother define what Sri Aurobindo action and what his life work meant. Sri Aurobindo about himself said in confidence to a number of disciples he wrote, "Let me tell you in confidence, I never was a philosopher. My teaching and my philosophy or yoga has come from my direct practice and my own sadhana." So that is why Sri Aurobindo was in quest for a yoga that could not only transform society, but humanity as a whole, transform human nature. It was not a life negating philosophy or yoga he was in search for, but a life affirming one, a yoga that could transform human nature, human society, in fact, bring about a new race, a new species. I'd like to today talk about the 4 principles. I mean, it's a vast subject. And I just want to pick up just 4 important principles that distinguish his yoga and make it a life-affirming and life-transforming one. His first important principle that underlies his yoga, his entire yoga practice and philosophy, is the evolution of consciousness. Sri Aurobindo believed that there was not only an evolution of consciousness, but actually everything was involved. So he believed that within matter, life was already involved. Within life, mind was already involved, and therefore it could evolve. Within mind, there was a higher consciousness, which he called the supramental or Gnostic consciousness, which was involved in mind and therefore could evolve. So the whole of his philosophy is based on this. In fact, he wrote, "The earth is a material field of evolution. Mind and life, supermind, Satchidananda, are in principle involved there in the earth consciousness. But only matter is at first organized. Then life descends from the life plane, and gives shape and organization and activity to the life matter or principle in matter. And then creates this principle in matter creates the plant and animal. Then mind descends from the mind plane, creating man. Now, supermind is to descend and to create a supramental race." His second important principle is the dual movement of the ascent and descent of consciousness that takes place in his yoga. Now, most yogas, as you know, talk about the ascent of consciousness through the chakras from the Sahasrara above into the spiritual consciousness to attain moksha or nirvana or any of the great realizations of our Indian yogas. Sri Aurobindo brought in very strongly and very clearly that there is not only an ascent, but if you want to transform life, if you wish to transform human beings, there needs to be a descent of spiritual consciousness, a descent of the supramental consciousness. So this dual movement of ascent and descent is a very important distinguishing feature of Sri Aurobindo's yoga. Unlike the other yogas, especially the ones that were in search of a realization of moksha nirvana, a spiritual realization that turned the consciousness towards the divine, however, left the body and the mind and the emotional being exactly where it was. Sri Aurobindo's yoga very clearly aims at transforming our mind, our life, the prana shakti, our emotional vital being, and our body, the physical consciousness. And for that, he said, unless you bring down the spiritual consciousness, unless you bring down the four things, he said, which are very important for that, for the spiritual transformation, the descent of peace, the descent of force, of power, the descent of light, and the descent of ananda. These are the four things that transform human nature, and these have to be brought down. How do you bring it down? This comes to the third principle of Sri Aurobindo's life-transforming yoga, which is the principle of the psychic being. In Sri Aurobindo's yoga, and especially the mother who brought this very forward in his yoga when she joined him and collaborated in his work in the ashram in the 1920s. I hope you remember that this is the 100th centenary of the mother's final arrival to India when she joined Sri Aurobindo. So this is not only 2020, not only marks the 148th anniversary of Sri Aurobindo's birth, but also the final arrival of the mother. And when she came to India, she brought to Sri Aurobindo's yoga a very important principle, which he adopted, and which was the principle of the bringing forward of the psychic being. This being the third most important principle in his integral yoga. And in this principle, what Sri Aurobindo says is that unless the psychic being is brought forward, becomes the leader of our life. And what is the psychic being? It is the Chaitya Purush of the Vedas or the Upanishads. That being that resides deep in us, in the center of our heart, behind the Anahat Chakra. That divine guide that resides in all human beings, that divine spark, unless that comes forward in the evolutionary growth of the individual, it is that that will lead the individual to divinization. So the third important principle that Sri Aurobindo brought forward was the psychic, the bringing forward of it, and its power to change the different parts of our being. The power of the psychic to integrate the being. Otherwise, the mind is going in one direction, the thoughts, the emotions and desires and the ego are in another direction. The physical, tamas and consciousness are in the third direction. And as you see, human beings are a very, very, what should I say, find life very difficult because they are unable to integrate themselves. It is the psychic that is the integrative factor. There is a whole practice, which we can come to later, about how to bring forward the psychic, the discipline and the practice of that. But the principle is important to understand. And why? Sri Aurobindo wrote about the psychic. If the psychic comes forward, there is no difficulty. There comes with it the psychic discrimination, a constant intimation, finally a governance which discloses and quietly and patiently removes all imperfections. So it is the psychic that removes all imperfections in us. It brings the right mental, the right vital movements and reshapes the physical consciousness. It is the psychic being, when it comes forward as the leader and guide, that can create this incredible integration of our personality. and then can give us intimations of where we should go, what we should do, what we should not do, and becomes our inner guide, the inner Veda. In fact, if you read the Synthesis of Yoga, there is a whole chapter on the 4 aids of the sadhak, and one of the aids is the bringing forward of the psychic being and opening the inner Veda in us, the Veda or the guide that will lead our lives. And now I'd like to come to the last principle, the fourth principle, which is extremely important, that makes Sri Aurobindo's yoga a life transformational one. And that is the principle of the descent of the supermind, the supramental principle that he brought forward. I think that is an original contribution, an original, what should I say, principle that Sri Aurobindo himself brought forward for the first time. And this principle of the Gnostic or the supramental consciousness brings the possibility of the conquest of illness, old age, and death. He said all of us aspire, the human race aspires in various ways, veiled and unveiled. There is an aspiration towards immortality. Somewhere in us, we all want to, live a full life, a whole life, a long life. And as you know, in the Isha Upanishad, made thousands of years ago, it said, verily man must aspire to live at least 100 years. But we must live those 100 years or 120 years, not with illness and infirmity, but in full vigor, in full strength, in full health, and with the consciousness of the spiritual. So this Sri Aurobindo brought forward. He said, and I'd like to quote here, all yoga which takes you entirely away from the world is a high but narrow specialization of divine tapasya. God in his perfection embraces everything. You also must become all-embracing. And he said, the practice of this yoga is double. One side is of an ascent of the consciousness to the higher planes, and the other side is the descent of the power of the higher planes into the earth consciousness, and to drive out the power of darkness and ignorance and transform nature. So with that, these 4 very important evolutionary principles, Sri Aurobindo in the end said that, in fact, he said, and Mother, of course, has written a lot about this in the agenda, he said, death is a bad habit. Death is not inevitable. We need to change our clothes because our body can't continue. But it is actually, if one knew the secret of infinite progress, if one was able to bring down this higher Gnostic principle, this higher supramental principle into the body, into the cells of the body, death is not inevitable. And he prophesied that in years to come, 300 to 500 maybe, there would be a new race. Just like man epitomizes the mental consciousness, there would be another new species that would epitomize the supramental consciousness. And that new species would have a plastic body, a body that need not decay to prolong. You have the choice to decide when you want to leave your body. You need not stay in it, and you need not leave it, because of this new consciousness. I'd like to end with 2 very important steps that he wrote to a disciple. Somebody asked Sri Aurobindo about what are the 2 great steps in your yoga. Sri Aurobindo wrote back to this disciple and said, there are 2 great steps in my yoga, the first of which is being open and to surrender to the divine Shakti, the mother. The Sri Aurobindo's yoga had its roots, as the last speaker also said, in a tantric tradition, but in the highest form of it, which meant that there is the Mahashakti of the Divine Mother, and that Shakti has to be brought down into the consciousness. A vast openness and surrender to that Mother, to that divinity, that principle of Mahashakti is a very, very important driving principle if you want to transform human nature, if you want to transform your own nature. And then somebody later asked him, Sir, you spoke about the first step in your yoga, which was the surrender and openness to the mother. What is the second great step in your yoga? And then he replied, aspiration, aspiration for a divine life. Aspiration. Unless you have a deep, burning aspiration for the divine, nothing can be done. First, you must want it. You must want to live a divine life. So the second great step in his yoga is aspiration for a divine life. Thank you.